There are two kinds of prisons in this world, the ones with steel bars and the ones we build for ourselves. For Julian Vance, the king of a financial empire, his prison was a fortress of logic and penthouse views, guarded by a grief he refused to acknowledge. He had everything under control until the day he inherited the two things he couldn't manage: a 6-year-old girl clutching a stuffed rabbit and the one woman on earth who hated him for the man he'd become. A last will and testament would force them under one roof. But a dangerous secret, hidden in the truth of his best friend's death, would be what forced them to become a family. Julian Vance stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, the New York City skyline sprawling beneath him like a conquered map. At 37, his life was a testament to brutal efficiency. His company, Pierce & Vance Financial, didn't just participate in the market, it consumed it. The silence in his penthouse office was absolute, a self-imposed vacuum designed to keep the messiness of the world at bay. But an hour ago, that silence had been shattered by a single phone call. Mark Pierce, his partner, his only real friend since their college days, was dead. A car accident on a winding mountain road in Colorado. A tragic, senseless, illogical end. Julian hadn't cried. The mechanisms for that kind of release had rusted shut years ago. He just stared at the city, the grief a cold, solid knot in his chest. Another variable to be analyzed and eventually dismissed. His focus was already shifting to the inevitable fallout. The market reaction, the emergency board meeting, the consolidation of power. It was a sequence of events he was uniquely qualified to handle. It was the only way he knew how to grieve. His intercom buzzed, a sterile sound that sliced through his thoughts. His assistant's voice, soft and hesitant, spoke. "Sir, Mr. Abernathy from the legal firm is here for the reading of Mr. Pierce's will." Julian's jaw tightened. So soon? Of course. Mark, ever the planner, would have insisted on expediency. "Send him in," Julian commanded, his voice a low monotone. He turned from the window and settled behind his massive desk, a slab of polished obsidian that served as both a workspace and a barrier. The lawyer entered, a portly man with a kind face that seemed out of place in this severe environment. But he was not alone. Trailing behind him, her movements stiff with animosity, was Clara Thompson, Mark's younger sister, the artist. All flowing fabrics and chaotic energy, her wavy auburn hair a stark, fiery contrast to the room's monochrome palette. She looked at Julian, and her warm brown eyes were cold with an accusation that needed no words. He knew she blamed him for Mark's death. Not directly, perhaps, but she blamed his world, the relentless pressure of their company. The world of cutthroat deals that she believed had ground her brother down. Mr. Abernathy cleared his throat, opening a leather-bound folder. "Thank you both for coming on such short notice." He began to read, the legal jargon a monotonous drone. Julian listened with half an ear, his mind already calculating the steps needed to absorb Mark's shares and stabilize the company. It was what their partnership agreement had always stipulated. But then Abernathy paused, his gaze lifting from the page. "And his controlling shares, along with his personal estate, are to be managed in a trust," he continued, "for the sole benefit of his only child, Maya Elizabeth Thompson." The words hung in the air, thick and impossible. Julian froze, his carefully constructed composure cracking for the first time. Child? Mark had a child. He risked a glance at Clara. Her face was a mask of pure shock, her mouth slightly agape. She didn't know either. How could Mark, a man who shared everything, have kept a secret this monumental? Abernathy, seemingly oblivious to the grenade he'd just detonated, kept reading. "The trust will be overseen by a court-appointed third party until the child reaches the age of 25. A daughter. Mark had a daughter, somewhere. The thought was a foreign object, lodging itself in Julian's mind. Before either of them could fully process the first revelation, Mr. Abernathy delivered the second. He looked over the rim of his glasses, his expression grave. Mark's will contains a very specific, and I must stress, legally binding guardianship clause. He took a deep, deliberate breath. He names you, Julian Vance, and you, Clara Thompson, as co-guardians for his daughter. The air crackled. Clara shot to her feet, her chair scraping harshly against the marble floor.
What? No. That's not possible. He and we can't. He would never.
That's absurd. There has to be a mistake. Mark and I had an agreement.
There is no mistake, Mr. Vance, the lawyer said, his voice firm, unshakable. And the clause has one final critical condition. To inherit your respective portions of the will, and for you, Mr. Vance, to assume voting control of Mark's shares in the company, the two of you must reside under the same roof and share physical custody of the child for a period of no less than 1 calendar year. A sentence, a life sentence, handed down from the grave by the one friend he thought he knew. He was trapped. Trapped with a ghost child he'd never met, and trapped with the one woman who looked at him and saw a murderer. The war began not with shouting, but with the quiet, jarring clash of two worlds. The next evening, Clara arrived at Julian's penthouse, a sterile expanse of white marble and minimalist black furniture that felt more like a modern art museum than a home. She was followed by a social worker and a small girl with wide, solemn brown eyes and her father's dark hair, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit as if it were a life raft. This was Maya, Mark's daughter, Julian's ward. Clara carried 2 mismatched, scuffed suitcases that looked utterly alien in the pristine environment. She walked in, her gaze sweeping over the cold, impersonal space, and her expression made it clear she was entering a prison. The social worker, a kind woman named Mrs. Gable, tried to smooth the transition, speaking in soft, therapeutic tones that grated on Julian's nerves. After a brief, awkward tour, Mrs. Gable left, and the 3 of them were alone. The silence was deafening.
The guest wing is down the hall. There are 2 bedrooms. You can take your pick.
We won't be any trouble. We'll stay out of your way.
It was a promise neither of them could possibly keep. As Clara led Maya down the hall, the little girl looked back at Julian, her expression not fearful but curious. It was a look that unnerved him more than Clara's open hostility. The house rules were established without a single spoken word. Julian would retreat to his study, immersing himself in work, a fortress of spreadsheets and conference calls. Clara and Maya would occupy the rest of the penthouse, their presence a constant low-level disruption to his ordered world. Within a day, a colorful finger-painted picture of a lopsided rainbow was taped to the $1 billion stainless steel refrigerator. A pair of small, muddy sneakers appeared by the door, a tiny monument to outdoor play. And the silence, the precious, productive silence, was replaced by the soft hum of cartoons and Clara reading bedtime stories in a gentle, soothing voice. At night, Julian would hear it through the walls, the cadence of her voice, rising and falling, and he would clench his jaw, infuriated by the intrusion, and more infuriated by the strange, hollow ache it produced in his chest. He was a stranger in his own home. Julian tried. In his own clumsy, logical way, he tried to connect with Maya. He saw fatherhood as a problem to be solved with resources. On the 3rd day, a delivery arrived, a ridiculously expensive, architecturally inspired dollhouse that was more a work of art than a toy. Maya looked at it, her expression unreadable, and then returned to the corner where she was building a lopsided fort out of couch cushions. The dollhouse sat untouched. Next, he bought her a brand new tablet, loaded with the best educational software money could buy. She thanked him politely, a small rehearsed phrase taught by her mother, and then set it aside to play with her worn-out rabbit. Julian didn't understand. He had provided the best tools, the best objects. Why wasn't it working? He didn't know how to talk to a child who had just lost her entire world. He only knew how to acquire things. So he tried to buy her happiness, and failed spectacularly every single time. Clara, on the other hand, would simply sit on the floor with Maya, a box of crayons between them, and they would draw for hours. Julian would watch from his office doorway, feeling like a ghost. It wasn't anger he felt watching them. It was a profound, frustrating envy. 2 weeks in, the arrangement felt like a cold war, fought in whispers and avoided glances. One night, unable to focus, Julian found himself driving to the deserted company headquarters. He needed to escape the unfamiliar sounds of his own home. He let himself into Mark's old office, a room he had ordered sealed. The air was stale, still holding the faint scent of Mark's coffee and the creative chaos he thrived in. Books on art and history sat beside financial ledgers. It was the office of a man with a foot in two worlds. Julian powered on Mark's old laptop, not sure what he was looking for. A connection. An answer. Anything. Most of the files were standard work, but in a draft folder, he found an unsent email, dated a week before the accident. It was addressed to Mark's personal account, a common practice when he wanted to review something away from the company's servers. The subject line was simple. Westlake problem. Julian's breath caught. Westlake, the hostile acquisition he and Mark had fought so viciously about. The deal Julian had pushed through despite Mark's strenuous objections. The email was short and cryptic. Something's not right with their numbers. Deeper than we thought. Feels dirty. Can't talk on the phone. Need to show you in person this week. Julian stared at the words, the screen's glow illuminating the sudden dread on his face. Mark had suspected something. He had been trying to warn him. And Julian had called him paranoid and hung up.
The turning point came on a Tuesday, 2 months into their forced cohabitation. A thunderstorm raged outside, the sound of it echoing through the vast empty spaces of the penthouse. Julian was in his study, the unsent email burning a hole in his conscience, when a small, terrified cry echoed from down the hall. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated fear. His first instinct was to ignore it, to assume Clara would handle it. But the cry came again, sharper this time, followed by a muffled sob. He stood, an unfamiliar protective instinct overriding his desire for isolation. He found Maya sitting bolt upright in her bed, her small body trembling, tears streaming down her face. The room was dark, save for the flashes of lightning that illuminated her terrified expression.
I had a bad dream. Daddy went away in his car and the car went boom, and he didn't come back.
It was just a dream, Maya. A nightmare. You're safe here.
But his words were hollow, logical. They did nothing to soothe her. She just kept crying, her small hands twisting the blanket. Just then, Clara appeared in the doorway, her face etched with concern. She didn't spare Julian a glance. She simply went to Maya, gathered the small, shaking girl into her arms, and began to hum. A low, soft, wordless melody that was all warmth and safety. Julian stood in the doorway, a silent, useless observer. He watched as Clara's effortless warmth quieted the storm inside the child. She rocked her gently, whispering reassurances.
It's okay, little bird. I'm here. You're safe. I've got you. It was just a scary thought, that's all. It's not real. I'm real. I'm right here.
He watched as Maya's sobs subsided into hiccups, as she buried her face in Clara's shoulder, her small fists unclenching. He saw the fierce, unconditional love in Clara's eyes. And for the first time, he didn't see an adversary. He saw a guardian, a protector.
He saw the woman his best friend had trusted with the most precious thing in his life, and he felt a profound, humbling shame. Without a word, he turned and walked back to his study. The image of them burned into his mind. The next morning, the atmosphere had shifted. He found Clara in the kitchen staring into a cup of coffee. The silence stretched between them, but it was different now, less hostile, more uncertain.
Thank you for last night with Maya. I didn't know what to do.
She misses him. The nightmares have been getting worse. She needs a stability neither of us can give her right now.
Julian leaned against the counter, a respectable distance away. The time for secrets was over. Clara, about Mark, his death. There's something I think you should know. He told her everything. About their last fight, about the Westlake deal, and about the unsent email. He watched her face as he spoke, saw the flicker of old anger, the stubborn set of her jaw. But as he continued, as he admitted his own guilt, his own failure to listen, he saw her defenses begin to crumble. The anger was replaced by a dawning, fearful understanding.
You think it wasn't an accident? You think someone did this to him?
I think Mark found something that someone was willing to kill to protect. And I think I pushed him away when he tried to tell me. I told him he was being emotional.
In that moment, they were no longer adversaries. They were two people united by a shared, terrible grief and a dawning, dangerous purpose. They had to find the truth, not just for the company and not just for their own conscience, but for Mark, for Maya. The investigation became their unspoken truce, a bridge across the chasm of their mutual distrust. Julian, with his access and near-limitless resources, began a quiet, deep dive into the Westlake acquisition. He hired a discreet team of private investigators and forensic accountants, men who operated in the shadows. His days became a double life, a powerful CEO by day, a clandestine investigator by night. Meanwhile, Clara, with her artist's intuition and her intimate knowledge of her brother, pieced together a different kind of puzzle. She went through Mark's personal effects, his journals filled with frantic scribbles, his old sketches that sometimes held hidden meanings. One afternoon, tucked inside a hollowed-out copy of Moby Dick, she found it. A single silver flash drive.
Julian, I think I found something.
He came into the living room where she had spread Mark's life across the floor. She held up the drive. It contained encrypted files, but the file names were telling. Westlake discrepancies, brake fluid analysis, Alistair Finch. Alistair Finch. The name hit Julian like a physical blow. Finch was the CEO of a rival company, a ruthless corporate predator who had been trying to acquire Westlake for years. The man Julian had outbid in a bitter, public battle. It took Julian's best cybersecurity expert 2 days to crack the drive. The contents were devastating. Mark had uncovered a massive fraud and money laundering scheme run by Finch through Westlake shell corporations. But it was the last file that made Julian's blood run cold. It was a formal report from a private mechanic, an analysis Mark had commissioned on his own car 2 days before his death. The report was clinical, precise, and utterly damning. The brake lines hadn't just failed. They had been deliberately, expertly severed. It wasn't an accident. It was murder. Julian printed the report, the paper feeling heavy as lead in his hands. He found Clara on the balcony, watching Maya chase butterflies in the small rooftop garden she had planted. He held out the pages, his own hand shaking slightly.
You were right. You were right to hate me. I didn't listen to him, and it got him killed.
Clara took the report, her eyes scanning the damning words. Tears streamed down her face, silent and hot. Julian braced himself for the accusation, for the rage he so richly deserved. But it never came.
She looked up at him, her grief mirroring his own, and she stepped forward, placing a comforting hand on his arm.
No, Julian. Finch killed him. You're just the one who has to live with it. We both are. Now, we make him pay.
With irrefutable proof, the world shifted. Julian handed the flash drive to the federal authorities. The takedown of Alistair Finch was swift and decisive, a media firestorm of corporate scandal, criminal charges, and whispered rumors. But through it all, Julian and Clara created a bubble of safety around Maya. They answered her questions with simple, honest truths. They protected her from the storm, their shared purpose forging a bond stronger than any legal document. 1 year later, almost to the day, Mr. Abernathy sat in Julian's living room once more. The room was different now. It was filled with light, with Maya's colorful artwork, with the comfortable clutter of a life well lived.
"The terms of the will have been met,"
the lawyer announced, a rare smile on his face.
"You are both free to pursue your own living arrangements. The guardianship, of course, remains joint."
He left, and the silence he left behind was heavy, not with tension, but with unspoken possibility. That evening, Julian came home from the office to a sight that made his heart stop. Clara was in the foyer, her 2 mismatched suitcases packed and standing by the door. Maya was watching, her face a mask of quiet worry, her stuffed rabbit clutched to her chest.
What are you doing?
The year is up. We held up our end of the deal. I found a place not far from here. It's close to a good school for Maya.
Julian looked from the suitcases to Maya's trembling lower lip to Clara's determined but sad eyes. And in that moment, the powerful CEO, the man who controlled empires, felt a terror far greater than any hostile takeover. He felt the cold, familiar silence of his old life reaching for him again. And he refused to go back.
Don't go!
Julian, we can't.
Please. This isn't about the will anymore. This has never been about the will. This place, this house was just a collection of expensive things. It wasn't a home until you and Maya got here. I wasn't whole until you got here. Stay. Not because Mark asked you to, but because I'm asking you to.
Clara looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the cold billionaire, but the man who read stories to her niece, the man who grieved her brother, the man who had against all odds become her partner, her family. A slow smile touched her lips. She walked over to her suitcases, unzipped one, and pulled out a lopsided, colorful painting of a family. A tall man, a woman with red hair, and a little girl holding a rabbit. She walked past Julian and taped it right back onto the billion-dollar refrigerator. Maya let out a happy little squeal. Julian finally let out the breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The will had forced them into a house, but it was love, born from grief and forgiveness, that had finally made it a home.